One punch. Prove it. The words cut through the noise of the gym like a blade through canvas, and every head in the room turned toward the mat where Sloane Mercer stood with her fists still loose at her sides. She was a celebrated black belt, the kind of fighter whose name got whispered before a tournament even started, and she was staring down a quiet mechanic named Darius Vale, like he was something she intended to solve. Nobody in that room expected the tired, plainly dressed man near the equipment bags to matter at all. He looked ordinary. He looked exhausted in the specific way single fathers look exhausted, like a man who had spent years carrying weight nobody else could see. But when Sloane finally moved on him, Darius did not flinch, did not raise his hands, did not do anything a frightened man would do. He simply shifted his weight, calm as still water, as though he had already lived through this exact moment before it happened. Then Sloane crossed a line she should not have crossed, and she demanded one final test, and the entire gym went so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming in the ceiling. Darius himself had come there to repair. What happened in the 3 seconds that followed changed the way every person in that building understood strength, and none of them ever spoke about it the same way again. The morning had started like any other morning at Reed Martial Arts, a converted warehouse on the edge of town with mirrored walls, scuffed blue mats, and the permanent smell of chalk and old leather that never quite left the air, no matter how many times the windows were opened. Sloane had just finished dropping a male sparring partner with a short, brutal combination, 3 strikes and a sweep, textbook and merciless, the kind of sequence coaches used in training videos to show students what precision looked like when it was fully committed. The room had gone silent for a beat, and then erupted into applause. The kind of applause reserved for someone who had proven, yet again, that she belonged at the top of every ranking board in the state. She stood in the center of the mat, catching her breath, chin high, satisfied in the particular way. Winners are satisfied when nobody has challenged them in a long while. That was when the side door opened, and Darius Vale walked in carrying a canvas tool bag, dressed in gray work clothes with his company logo stitched over the breast pocket, there for one reason only, to fix a ventilation unit that had been rattling above the east wall for 2 weeks straight. He did not look at the mat. He did not look at Sloane. He nodded once to the front desk attendant and made his way toward the ladder already set up near the vents, moving like a man who wanted to finish the job and leave before anyone noticed him. Trent Holloway noticed him anyway. Trent had been training at that gym for 11 years, long enough to consider himself something like a permanent fixture, and he had a habit of sizing up every stranger who walked through the door as either a threat or a joke. He looked Darius up and down. The tool bag, the plain boots, the quiet posture, the way his eyes stayed low and unbothered, and he laughed under his breath loud enough for the room to hear. Sloane turned. She watched Darius climb halfway up the ladder before she called out to him, a question dressed up as friendliness, but sharpened at the edges. "You train here too?" Darius glanced down, one hand still on the ladder rail. "No," he said, "just fixing the vents." Sloane smiled, the kind of smile that made people around her laugh even when nothing was funny. "Then stay off the mat," she said. "We wouldn't want you getting hurt." Darius said nothing. He climbed the rest of the way, opened the vent panel, and got to work. And for a few minutes, the gym went back to its usual rhythm. Bodies moving, pads slapping, Malcolm Reed calling out corrections from the sideline in the low, gravel voice of a man who had been doing this since before most of his students were born. But Sloane was not finished. She walked to the heavy bag positioned almost directly beneath the ladder and threw a hard right cross that snapped the chain and sent a gust of air brushing past Darius's shoulder as he worked. It was close. Close enough to be deliberate. Darius simply leaned his upper body a few inches to the side without looking down, finished tightening a bolt, and kept working. Sloane noticed. She threw another strike, harder this time, angled closer. And again Darius shifted just enough, no wasted motion, no panic, nothing that looked like performance. It looked like habit, the kind of habit that lives in a body long after the reason for it has been forgotten. Something in Sloane's chest tightened. The particular irritation of a person used to being the most dangerous body in any room, suddenly unsure whether that was still true. She stepped back from the bag and looked up at him directly. "Are you dodging me?" she asked. Darius climbed down the ladder, set his tools on the floor, and met her eyes for the first time. "I just don't want to get hit," he said, his voice flat and unbothered. Trent burst out laughing from across the room, the kind of laugh meant to be heard. Sloane did not laugh. She stepped closer, close enough that the whole gym stopped what it was doing to watch. "One punch," she said. "Prove it." Darius looked at her for a long moment, and then he shook his head. "I'm not here for that," he said, and he reached down for his tool bag as if the conversation were already over. It was the refusal that did it. Not the dodging, not the calm, but the flat, unhurried no. That suggested he simply did not care what anyone in that room thought of him. In a place built entirely around proving things, a man who refused to prove anything became the most interesting person in the building. Sloane's jaw tightened. "If you won't fight me," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "then I'll show this whole gym exactly what you really are. A performer hiding behind quiet." Darius did not answer. He simply zipped his tool bag closed, and the silence that followed was heavier than any punch that had been thrown that morning. Malcolm watched the exchange from near the front desk and said nothing, but something in the way the mechanic had moved stayed with him for the rest of the day, an itch at the back of his mind he could not quite name. Over the next few days, pieces of Darius Vale's life surfaced the way pieces always surface in a small, tightly knit training community, in fragments, in rumors, in things half overheard near the front counter between classes. He was 39 years old and worked as an industrial equipment technician, the kind of job that kept his hands rough and his schedule unpredictable, called out at odd hours to fix machines that could not wait until morning. He was a single father, though no child ever appeared at the gym, and the details of that part of his life stayed carefully, deliberately private, folded away behind the same quiet he carried into every room. What people gathered instead was smaller and quieter, the outline of a man rebuilding something after a marriage that had ended, a man who had chosen a simple, unremarkable life on purpose, and a man who seemed determined never to be looked at twice. He did not want conflict. That much was obvious to anyone paying attention to the way he moved through the building, always near the walls, always finishing his work quickly, always gone before anyone could ask him too many questions. But Sloane kept circling back to him every time their paths crossed, needling him with the same argument dressed in different words. A person who is truly strong should never be afraid of being tested, she told him one afternoon while he worked on a wiring panel near the lobby. Darius did not even turn around. "A person who is truly strong doesn't need to prove it every single day," he said. The words landed harder than he probably intended. Sloane felt the sting of them, like an insult aimed directly at her identity. Because proving herself was the entire architecture of who she had built herself to be, brick by brick, tournament by tournament, since she was a teenager standing on her first competition mat with shaking hands. Trent, sensing blood in the water, stepped in immediately, the way he always did when there was tension to inflame. "One punch," he said, grinning. "If he's really as tough as he acts, he won't say no." Malcolm Reed, watching from near the mirrors with his arms folded, said nothing out loud, but he had started paying closer attention to Darius than anyone realized. He noticed the way the man stood when he thought no one was looking, weight distributed low and centered, shoulders relaxed instead of tense, feet angled at a distance most untrained people never bothered to consider. He noticed that Darius's eyes tracked the shoulders and hips of the fighters around him instead of their hands, a detail so small that most people would never register it. But Malcolm had spent 40 years around fighters, and he knew exactly what that particular habit meant. That was not the posture of a man who had never been in a fight. That was the posture of a man who had been trained to survive one, and trained by someone who understood the difference between fighting for sport and fighting to stay alive. "I've seen that stance before," Malcolm said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for Darius to hear from across the room. Darius stopped what he was doing and turned around slowly, and for the first time since he had walked through the door, something in his expression shifted, brief and unguarded, gone as quickly as it appeared, like a door opening a crack and closing again, before anyone could see inside. 2 days later, Sloane arranged what she called a simple demonstration, nothing dramatic, Just a strike pad test to settle the argument once and for all. No sparring, no real contact, just one clean punch into a target she would hold herself, steady against her forearms, the way she had held pads for 100 students before him. Darius resisted at first, but the pressure in the room had built to the point where refusing again would have felt like admitting something he was not ready to admit. He agreed, reluctantly, on the condition that it end there, and nothing more would be asked of him afterward. Sloane braced the pad against her forearms and nodded for him to go. Darius stepped forward, exhaled once, and threw a single straight punch. The sound that came out of the pad was wrong, too loud, too sharp, a crack that echoed off the mirrored walls and made two students on the far side of the room turn instinctively toward the noise. The impact ripped the target clean out of Sloane's grip and sent it skidding several feet across the mat. The room went dead silent. Sloane looked down at her own hands, unhurt but trembling slightly. The force of what she had just absorbed, nothing close to what she had expected from a man who claimed he did not fight. Trent broke the silence first. "Lucky shot," he muttered, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Sloane wanted to test it again, this time for real, and before Darius could object, she was already moving toward him with real speed, a combination aimed to close distance and force a reaction. Darius reacted, but not the way anyone expected. He slipped the first strike, then the second, then a third, each movement so minimal it barely looked like effort at all, his feet never crossing, his balance never breaking. He never counterattacked. He simply was not there when her fists arrived, over and over, until Sloane's frustration boiled into something close to fury, and she threw a hard, committed straight punch aimed directly at his center. Darius caught it. Not with force, not with a block meant to punish, but with a redirection so subtle that Sloane's own momentum carried her past him and nearly off her feet. She stumbled, caught herself, and turned back toward him breathing hard, humiliated in front of a room full of people who had watched her lose control of her own attack against a man who had not thrown a single offensive strike. Darius released her arm immediately and stepped back. "I told you," he said quietly. "I don't want to fight." He picked his tool bag back up as if that settled the matter entirely, but the room around him had already stopped believing it could be settled that easily. Malcolm crossed the mat before anyone else could speak. He picked up Darius's hand for a brief moment, studying the calluses along the knuckles, the specific pattern of wear that only came from years of very particular training, the kind built through thousands of repetitions, against something far harder than a padded target. "Did you study under Elias Crow?" he asked. The question hit the room like a dropped weight. Darius went completely still, his hand pausing in Malcolm's grip, a beat too long before he pulled it back. The name meant almost nothing to the newer students, but to the older fighters in that gym, Elias Crow was something close to legend, a trainer who had shaped some of the most dangerous fighters of his generation, and then vanished from the community without explanation more than a decade earlier, leaving behind rumors that multiplied every year he stayed gone. Nobody had heard from him since. Nobody knew where he had gone. Darius's silence in that moment said more than any answer could have, and Malcolm, who had trained alongside Elias in another lifetime, recognized that silence instantly for what it was. "I don't know him," Darius finally said, his voice flat in a way that did not sound convincing to anyone in the room, least of all Malcolm, who had known Elias personally decades earlier and recognized the particular economy of movement Elias used to drill into his students. Movement built around efficiency rather than display, control rather than aggression. Sloane's curiosity sharpened into something closer to obsession after that. She went home that night and went looking for Darius Vale online, searching for any record of tournaments, rankings, footage, anything that would explain the level of control she had just witnessed firsthand. She found nothing. No medals, no fight history, no videos, no profile in any database that tracked competitive fighters across the country. Not even a mention in a local newsletter from some forgotten regional event. To Sloane, the absence of proof read as proof of something else entirely, that Darius was simply performing calm, hiding behind mystery, because he had nothing real to back it up. She confronted him the next day near the equipment room, arms crossed, voice hard. "Tomorrow," she said. "The mat. No more running from it." Darius refused again, calmly, the same way he had refused every time before. But Sloane had one more card to play, and she used it without hesitation. "You're not just disrespecting me," she said. "You're disrespecting every person in this gym who has worked their whole life to be good at this. If you really believe strength doesn't need proving, then prove that too, by standing there and losing on purpose." It was a manipulative argument and both of them knew it, but it worked exactly the way she intended it to. Darius exhaled slowly, the fight going out of his resistance all at once, his shoulders dropping the way a man's shoulders drop when he realizes a road he had hoped to avoid has closed behind him. "Fine," he said. "One round. No stakes, no cameras, no crowd beyond the people already training here." Malcolm objected immediately, arguing that this had already gone too far, that whatever Darius was hiding deserved to stay hidden if that was what he wanted. But Sloane would not be moved, and the match was set for the following afternoon, regardless of what anyone else in the room thought about it. That evening, before leaving the building, Darius paused near the far wall, where Malcolm kept a small collection of old photographs and memorabilia from decades of running the gym. Among them hung a faded badge behind glass, a symbol that meant nothing to most of the people who walked past it every day without a second glance. But Darius stopped in front of it for several seconds, and something in his jaw tightened because he recognized exactly what it represented and exactly which kind of people were trained to wear it. A symbol from a world he had spent years trying to leave far behind him. The next day, the gym was packed tighter than it had been in months, word having spread through the training community the way it always did, quietly and quickly, through phone calls and hallway conversations and the kind of low murmur that precedes something everyone wants to see, but nobody wants to admit they are curious about. Sloane walked onto the mat with the same confidence she carried into every match, rolling her shoulders, stretching her neck, every motion practiced and sharp. Darius walked out a few minutes later in silence. No warm-up, no posturing, no acknowledgement of the crowd gathered along the mirrored walls. He simply stepped onto the mat and waited, hands loose at his sides, expression unreadable. Sloane opened fast, testing his reactions with a quick jab-cross combination. Darius slipped both. She adjusted her angle and tried again, faster this time, and again he moved just enough to avoid contact without ever stepping outside a controlled radius, never retreating further than necessary, never giving ground he did not need to give. The room began to notice something strange happening beneath the surface of the exchange. Darius was not simply avoiding her attacks. He was controlling the pace of the entire fight, forcing Sloane to move exactly where he wanted her to move, using the smallest possible motion to stay one step ahead of everything she threw at him. She launched a longer combination, 4 strikes chained together, each one sharper and more committed than the last, her frustration beginning to bleed into her technique in ways her coaches would have corrected in any other setting. Darius countered none of it, deflecting the smallest amount necessary, never wasting a single unnecessary movement, his breathing steady, his eyes calm. Sloane's breathing grew heavier. Sweat had started along her hairline. Darius remained completely unbothered, his chest rising and falling at a resting pace that made the gap between them feel almost insulting to a woman who had never once, in 15 years of competitive fighting, felt this outmatched by someone who had not thrown a single offensive strike. "Who are you?" she finally demanded between breaths. "Someone who doesn't want to hurt you," Darius answered simply. The words only made her angrier. She surged forward with everything she had left, and for the first time since the match began, Darius raised his hands into a guarded position, the first sign that he intended to do more than simply avoid her, and the entire room seemed to lean forward at once, sensing the shift before it fully happened. Sloane threw her hardest strike, a committed right hand meant to end the exchange decisively, every ounce of frustration and pride behind it. Darius stepped directly into the attack, instead of away from it, rotating his hips in one clean motion, and delivered a single counterpunch that connected with enough force to send her stumbling backward several feet before she caught herself against the mat's edge. The sound of the impact silenced the entire room instantly, the kind of silence that felt physical, pressing down on every person watching, thick enough that someone near the back audibly gasped and then immediately covered their own mouth. Darius did not follow up. He lowered his hands immediately and stepped back, turning halfway away from her, as though the exchange had already concluded in his mind, as though continuing would have violated some rule only he could see. Sloane straightened slowly, more shaken by the fact that she had been moved that easily than by any pain from the strike itself, her ears ringing faintly, her balance still catching up to what her body had just absorbed. What unsettled her most, once the shock cleared, was the realization that Darius had clearly held back, that whatever she had just felt was only a fraction of what he was actually capable of delivering if he had chosen to. Malcolm, watching from the sideline, said quietly to no one in particular, if he had used full power. He did not finish the sentence. Nobody needed him to. Trent, furious on Sloane's behalf and unwilling to accept what he had just witnessed, stepped onto the mat himself and challenged Darius directly, demanding a turn, his pride refusing to let the moment stand. Darius refused, calmly, the same tone he had used from the very beginning. Trent lunged anyway, reckless and overconfident, throwing his full weight into a wild attempt at a takedown, and Darius needed only a single, small adjustment of his stance to redirect Trent's own momentum against him, dropping him to the mat without ever throwing a strike, the impact more embarrassing than painful. Sloane watched all of it with an expression that had shifted entirely from contempt into something closer to disbelief, and beneath that, something closer to respect she did not yet want to admit to feeling, a feeling that sat uncomfortably against everything she had said to him over the past week. "Where did you learn this?" she asked quietly, no longer performing for the crowd around them, her voice smaller than anyone in that room had ever heard it. Darius looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Somewhere you're not allowed to ask the name of," he said. And the words hung in the air heavier than anything either of them had said all week, settling over the gym like a held breath nobody wanted to release. It was in that silence that Elias Crow walked through the front doors of the gym for the first time in over a decade, an older man with a weathered face, gray at the temples, and eyes that immediately found Darius across the room without needing to search, as though some instinct had guided him there before he ever consciously decided to come. No introduction was necessary. The two men simply looked at each other, and something passed between them that the rest of the room could sense but not fully understand, a shared history compressed into a single, wordless exchange. Sloane stood frozen, watching the exact person she had been searching for online appear in front of her like a ghost stepping out of rumor. "So," Elias said, his voice low and steady as he crossed the mat, "I've been wondering how long it would take before you got pulled back into this." Darius's shoulders dropped slightly, the posture of a man who had been caught mid-escape, a man who had almost made it out clean. "I wasn't trying to be pulled back into anything," he said. "I was fixing a vent." Elias allowed a small, tired smile, the kind that carried both understanding and a trace of sorrow underneath it. Malcolm approached the two of them, and for the first time, the older trainer began explaining, carefully and deliberately, exactly who Darius Vale had once been. "Not a competitive fighter chasing medals or rankings," Elias said, "but something entirely different. A student trained specifically to control dangerous situations in the shortest possible amount of time, the kind of training reserved for people whose job it was to keep others safe when everything fell apart around them." Darius had once been the best student to ever pass through that specific kind of instruction, sharper and steadier than anyone Elias had trained before or since. And years earlier, he had used those skills during a serious incident that Elias would not describe in detail, an event that had protected a group of people from real harm during a moment nobody in that room would ever fully understand. After that, Darius disappeared from that world entirely. He walked away from recognition, from opportunity, from a path that could have made him one of the most respected names in that field, and chose instead the quiet, unremarkable life of an ordinary man, a life measured in work orders and repair calls instead of accolades. He became a father. After his marriage ended, that choice mattered to him even more. because it meant showing up every day for the one part of his life he refused to let fall apart. Even if the details of that stayed carefully outside the story anyone else got to hear, a private world, he protected the way other men protected their reputations. Sloane stood there, absorbing all of it, feeling the weight of every dismissive comment she had made over the past several days settle heavily in her chest, each word replaying in a voice that no longer sounded like the confident, dismissive version of herself she had been a week earlier. The man she had mocked in front of an entire gym had lived through experiences she could not begin to imagine, and had chosen silence not out of weakness, but out of something closer to peace. A peace she suddenly understood she had spent years trying to earn, without ever finding it. She thought about every tournament she had ever won, every trophy lined up on the shelf in her apartment, and for the first time none of it felt like it answered the question she had spent her whole career trying to answer, the question of what it actually meant to be strong. Malcolm watched her face change as the pieces settled into place, and he remembered, briefly, why he had opened this gym in the first place, all those years ago. Not to build champions, but to teach people the difference between power and control, a distinction that got lost more often than he liked to admit, somewhere between the first trophy and the 10th. He said nothing to Sloane in that moment. Some lessons had to be allowed to land on their own, without anyone standing over them, explaining what they meant. Elias reached into a small bag he had carried in with him and produced an old, worn box. He held it out to Darius, without a word. Inside, resting on faded fabric, was a badge identical to the one Darius had stopped in front of the day before, the same symbol behind Malcolm's glass frame. Darius looked at it for a long moment before speaking. "I buried that part of my life," he said quietly. Elias shook his head. "No," he said, "that part of your life never buried you." That night, after the crowd had finally dispersed and the mats had been rolled back into their usual quiet order, Malcolm stayed behind with Elias, the two old friends sitting on folding chairs near the front counter, the way they used to sit decades earlier, before either of them had gray in their hair. "I always wondered what happened to him," Malcolm said, watching the parking lot through the front glass, long after Darius's truck had disappeared down the road. Elias nodded slowly. "He wondered the same thing about himself for a long time," he said. "Some people run from what they were because they're ashamed of it. Darius ran from it because he was afraid of loving it too much, afraid of what kind of father he would become if that part of him ever got to choose again." Malcolm turned that thought over in silence, the two of them sitting together in the half-dark, the hum of the ventilation system Darius had fixed drifting quietly overhead, steady now, no longer rattling, as if even the building itself had settled into something calmer. The days that followed carried a different weight through the gym. Sloane replayed her own words over and over in her mind, each one landing harder the more she thought about them. "One punch. Prove it. You're just a repairman. You don't have the guts to fight." She had said all of it with total confidence, certain she understood exactly what kind of person stood in front of her, and she had been wrong in almost every possible way. Wrong, in a way that reshaped how she looked at every stranger who walked through that door afterward. She found Darius near the equipment room one afternoon and forced herself to say what she had been avoiding. "I owe you an apology," she said. Darius shook his head slightly. "You don't need to apologize for challenging me," he said. "Then what do I need to apologize for?" she asked. Darius met her eyes directly. "For believing your strength gave you permission to look down on someone else," he said. The words struck harder than anything that had happened on the mat because there was no way to argue with them, and Sloane found herself nodding slowly instead of defending herself the way she once would have. Something in Sloane began to shift after that conversation, quietly, without fanfare, the beginning of a different kind of understanding about what strength actually meant, an understanding that had nothing to do with rankings or medals or how loudly a room applauded after a well-placed combination. While she wrestled with that shift internally, Trent moved in the opposite direction entirely. Unable to accept what he had witnessed, he became obsessed with uncovering something that would discredit Darius, convinced there had to be an explanation that made all of it less impressive, less real, something that would return the world to the shape he understood. He dug through old records, called contacts he barely knew, pulled at every thread he could find until he stumbled across a file buried deep enough that it should never have surfaced at all. The moment he opened it, a single word stopped him cold. Classified. Beneath that stamp was a photograph, old and slightly damaged at the edges, showing a much younger Darius standing in what looked like an official setting, formal and tense, the kind of photograph that belonged in a briefing room rather than a family album. Trent stared at the person standing beside him in that photograph, and the color drained from his face entirely. Trent brought the photograph to the gym the next morning, printed and folded inside his jacket pocket, convinced it would finally tear down whatever image the rest of the room had started building around Darius Vale. He waited until the largest crowd of the day had gathered before pulling it out, holding it up like evidence in a courtroom, certain the reveal would humiliate the man, the way he felt he himself had been humiliated on the mat days earlier. "Look at this," he said, his voice too loud, too eager. Classified. He's hiding something. Instead of the reaction he expected, the room went still in a different way entirely. A stillness built not from suspicion, but from something closer to awe, because the people old enough to recognize the setting in that photograph understood immediately what they were looking at, even if Trent himself did not. The photograph revealed something none of them had considered. The setting was a high-security event from years earlier, one surrounded by rumors that had never been fully explained to the public, the kind of story that occasionally surfaced in fragments before disappearing again, just as quickly. Darius was not the individual being protected in that image. He was the one standing between danger and everyone else in the frame, positioned exactly where a person trained to absorb the first moment of crisis would stand, closest to the door, closest to the threat, furthest from safety. But that was not the end of what came to light. Malcolm. Once Trent brought the photograph forward, and the entire story finally broke open in front of the whole gym, explained the rest of it with a heaviness in his voice that made it clear how much respect he carried for the man standing quietly at the edge of the room. Darius had once been on the verge of becoming one of the most recognized names in that entire field, an opportunity most people would have chased without hesitation, without a single moment of doubt. He turned all of it down. He walked away from prestige, from recognition, from every version of a life that would have made him famous, and chose instead the version of life almost nobody else would have chosen: a quiet apartment, steady work with his hands, and the responsibility of raising a family on his own after everything else in his life had fallen apart around him. He never wanted the medals. He never wanted the attention. He never wanted anyone in that gym, or anywhere else, to know who he had been before he became the man fixing their ventilation system, the man who showed up on time, finished the job, and left without asking for anything more than what the invoice said he was owed. Sloane finally understood the mistake she had made from the very beginning, the mistake so many people make when they encounter quiet instead of noise. She had mistaken his silence for weakness, when in truth his silence was the strongest thing about him, stronger than anything he could have shown her on the mat. Elias, standing near the back of the room with his arms folded, spoke once more before the moment passed entirely. "He is not strong because he can defeat other people," Elias said. "He is strong because he was able to defeat the part of himself that wanted recognition and walk away from it completely, and keep walking away from it every single day since." Darius closed the lid of the old box gently, the badge disappearing back into darkness where it had rested for years, and slung his tool bag over one shoulder, ready to leave the gym the same quiet way he had entered it days earlier. Before he reached the door, Sloane stepped in front of him, her posture entirely different from the woman who had demanded one punch and proof less than a week before, softer now, stripped of the performance she usually wore into every room. "I want to learn that," she said. Darius studied her for a moment, searching for whether the request came from genuine change or wounded pride, and something in her expression convinced him it was the former, an honesty he had not expected to find in someone who had spent the entire week trying to prove him wrong. The final chapter of that week belonged entirely to Sloane's transformation. She no longer needed to prove she was the strongest fighter in the room. What she wanted instead was something far more difficult to master: the ability to control the power she already had, rather than constantly reaching to prove it existed a lesson that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with restraint. Darius agreed to teach her exactly one lesson. Not a technique, not a strike, not a way to defeat an opponent, but something almost nobody ever bothered to teach at all. Something Elias himself had spent years trying to instill in students who rarely learned it fully. She trained differently after that, quieter, more deliberate, spending less time trying to overwhelm her sparring partners, and more time simply watching them, the way Darius had watched every attack coming before it arrived. Malcolm noticed the change first, the way she began leaving space in her combinations, instead of filling every second with aggression, the way she started asking questions about control instead of power. Even Trent noticed, though he never said so out loud, and after a few weeks, he stopped bringing up the photograph entirely, quietly returning to his usual training, as though the whole episode had simply been absorbed into the walls of the gym, along with everything else that had happened there over the years. Knowing when not to throw the punch, Sloane asked him what the strongest strike really was, expecting some technical answer about mechanics or timing or leverage, the kind of answer she could have written down and drilled into her body through repetition. Darius looked at her steadily. "The punch you never need to throw," he said. The gym fell silent around them, the weight of the answer settling over everyone who had gathered to watch. Students and instructors alike, suddenly reconsidering years of training they had built entirely around the opposite idea. Malcolm allowed himself a small, satisfied smile from the sideline, and Elias stood quietly near the back, watching the moment unfold exactly the way he had hoped it eventually would, the lesson finally passing from one generation to the next, in the one room where it mattered most. Darius gathered his tools and walked toward the exit the same way he had walked in days earlier, without ceremony, without applause, without any interest in being remembered for what had happened. No medal waited for him, no title, no crowd chanting his name through the doors of the building. But this time, as he crossed the room, every person present rose to their feet in silence, a gesture that meant more than any applause ever could have, more sincere than anything the loudest victory in that gym had ever earned. Sloane lowered her head as he passed, not because she had lost a fight, but because she had finally understood something far more important than winning. A person who is truly strong does not need the entire world to know it. Outside, the evening air had cooled, and Darius walked toward his truck at his own unhurried pace, tool bag slung over one shoulder, the badge tucked safely back into its box beneath the passenger seat, where it would likely stay for years to come. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen, a short message waiting from someone close to him. "Everything okay?" Darius allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first real one anyone had seen from him all week. "Yeah," he typed back. "Just finished something." He slid the phone into his pocket, climbed into the truck, and pulled out of the lot, leaving the gym behind him exactly the way he had found it, unremarkable, unassuming, and quiet, the way he had always intended to keep it, the way he would keep it again tomorrow, and the day after that, for as long as the world let him.